The following is an interview of Rupert Sheldrake by Bajramovic, MD, and Paul LeMay. It was recorded in Montreal, Canada, on May 16, 2004.
I wanted to ask you about your concept of time, because you were kind of hinting yesterday some things about time, so I want to know how you understand time.
I see it biologically. I mean, I see everything as a process. The whole universe has an arrow of time. If the universe began with a big bang and it's expanded, it means that there's a process in time and a direction in time. So I think time has a polarity. There's a polarity between past and future. And within living organisms, all of them have a time because they're all moving towards a goal or an end. You know, an embryo is developing towards maturity, a seedling is developing towards a mature plant. So just as there's an internal time of development towards an end or a goal in organisms, so there is in the universe. So I see this kind of biological time as primary, and cyclical time, the kind we get from the cycles of the sun and the moon, as something that's arisen out of the cosmic developmental process. Because I think time has a polarity, I think there's a difference between past and future. And that morphic memory principle, so each kind of thing draws on a collective memory. And so I think there's a radical difference between past and future. I'm not one of these people who thinks that there's no such thing as time, it's all an illusion, and that everything's basically timeless. I think time's polar and the very condition of life in the universe.
Although when you talk about morphic field, you seem to be saying it's kind of timeless, really. It's out of time, which has capacity to connect with the past or the future or now time. So it's kind of, to me, it's
no,
very...
I'm not saying it's equally the past and the future. I think morphic resonance comes from the past. It's a habit principle, right. A memory principle. I don't think it comes from the future. If it did, you wouldn't be able to test the theory because the future is limitless. We don't know how much there is. And any theory that says there are influences from the future is untestable because you don't know how much future there is or what will happen. I think we're open to the future in a different way, through precognitions, through premonitions. We get glimpses or influences from the future, but they're usually from the near future and they're usually intermittent, whereas the memory, the influence from the past, is from all the past and there's a lot more of it.
So the time that you're talking about is time in the material world, which is linear, right? And
yes.
It's kind of one-directional. I mean, when
Yes.
the process materializes itself, it creates its own spatial and temporal existence.
Yes.
It kind of creates its own life,
Yes.
and creates sequence of events that we call time or life, right? And it is one-directional. But on the pure energy level, another question that I want to ask you about that is how you see the energy creating material world and material world going back into the energy, because when you create morphic field, there is material things that are happening, constellation of those things that are happening, right? And they're creating energy field, right? Which is kind of pure energy, which has the knowledge to which we can access by resonance, right? So how do you see those two interacting?
I don't see energy as being outside time. I see energy as being a flow, a principle of flow or change, which is in itself directional. I mean, energy has a direction of flow, and the form it takes up is shaped by fields, so the morphic fields give form to the energy. I'm talking about energy in the normal sense. I mean, the normal sense of energy is the principle of actuality or activity.
Yeah, like electromagnetic energy.
Or heat energy or light energy,
sound,
all these forms of energy.
Yeah, which do seem to have kind of unidirectional
Yes.
way. Yeah.
So I don't myself take the view that there's a completely timeless world. I think that the morphic resonance works across time. I don't think that it depends on how far in the past it was. So I think that all of the past is potentially present everywhere. So I don't think that if something's 10 years ago, it has 10 times less influence than something 1 year ago. I think that in that sense, there is no diminution of influence over time. But that's different from saying things are timeless or outside time. I mean, people may experience a state of being outside time in mystical intuition, but I don't myself. I'm not a Platonist, and I'm not a believer in a kind of totally timeless realm. Even theologically, I don't believe that the universe is outside time. No, I don't think God's outside time. I think God participates in time and works through time.
Well, talking about time, I have a trick question here, which is you're so much ahead of other people. You're so much outside of other people's time. How do you deal with the loneliness of it?
Oh, well, I mean, it's not, I don't see it as...
Last night I saw Fox. He was trying to be with you, right? But he actually brought you to him. So you were with him. He was not able to be with you. He understood some concepts of what you're talking about, but was trying to bring you to his level and say, you be with me. And he kind of made an attempt to be with you. So I saw that kind of sense of loneliness of a leader. Well, I don't know how you deal with that.
Well, I mean, within the science community, I mean, certainly I don't have a lot of people who are doing the same kind of thing as I'm doing. There are a few. I think on a sort of daily basis, I have maybe 4 or 5 colleagues in the world, mostly people working in parapsychology, who I can talk to in a fairly straightforward way. They all have different views of time. Some of them have a view that the past and the future are equal. I mean, that's some of my friends and colleagues take that view. Well, I mean, I just find that at one level what I'm doing is not particularly lonely, in the sense that insofar as I'm looking at ordinary experience, where people do experience premonitions, they do experience telepathy, they do experience the sense of being stared at. These are things that most people have experienced. So a lot of things I do research on, far from being extraordinary and totally off the map of other people's experience, are actually to do with ordinary experience. And that's why I can write about my research in popular newspapers and get a lot of people understanding what I'm saying. So at that level, it's not particularly lonely. It's dealing with ordinary experience, which is normally ignored by science. In terms of working within biology, the way I'm thinking about living organisms is definitely rather different from the way molecular biologists and most of my colleagues think. And I do think they're working with an extremely narrow and limited perspective. But, you know, I don't feel particularly lonely. I do wish sometimes there were more scientists open to a broader approach. But I find more who are open to it in private than in public. There are a lot of people who are prepared to be open and interested in private, but very few would actually say so in public. Science is full of closet holists, but they don't change the way they do research because they know they wouldn't get it funded, and they don't like to speak about these things in public because they're afraid of what others will think.
Well, how do you think that can change? I mean, what you're saying is there is all kinds of judging out there, and judging is based on previous norms, and all the previous norms worked for a certain period of time where they were created, right? But the more we move in time, the less they're fitting.
Yes.
And yet people tend to adhere to those, and the judging becomes the most primitive way of adhering to those. I heard, well, I better not mention names anyway. Well, I heard some people just using that, people who claim they're not doing it, but they're doing that yesterday at the meeting. So what is the hope there? How do we make the change? How do we make people open their minds and just be and see the simplicity of what you're saying? Well, I think genius can see the simplicity of things and make it so obvious to everybody. And I think that's what you do.
Well, it's nice of you to think that. I think that part of the change is in science will depend on the change in funding, because most scientists simply do what they're paid to do. If they get a grant to do something, they work on it. If there's lots of money for cancer research, they work on that. If there's lots of money for atom bombs, they work on those. So the scientific activity entirely follows where the funding is. And so at the moment I'm trying to think of different ways of science funding. And a scheme I've proposed in Britain, which I've actually got several politicians taking quite seriously. I published it in New Scientist, also in the New York Times. is this scheme that 1% of science funding should be given to fund research that actually interests taxpayers, who pay for 100%. And the minute science is open to a kind of democratic spirit, which at present it isn't, things would be very different. So I'm proposing opening 1% to a kind of democratic principle, leaving 99% as totally undemocratic, run by a kind of college of cardinals, as it is at present. And you see in Britain, the Medical Research Council, which decides where to spend the government money for medical research, they spend about £1 billion a year. This council consists of a committee made up of establishment medical researchers who represent the conventional orthodox position of the mainstream, together with representatives of biotechnology and drug companies and one or two government officials. And they decide how all public money is spent. And because none of them are interested in alternative or complementary medicine, not one penny gets spent on that. Now, if we had 1% open to public interests, and certainly most people in the public are interested in alternative and complementary medicine, then why shouldn't some of the medical research money be spent on that? As soon as you open it up in that way, it would change. And most people are interested in psychical research and telepathy and things like that. There's never been a penny of public money spent on these things. Why not? If science were democratically open, these are certainly topics that a lot of people would find interesting. And there are a lot of much more mundane things which people would find interesting. I mean, consumer research, which products are safe, what food products are safe, dietary systems. There's virtually no money spent on the Atkins diet versus low-fat diet. I mean, people make pronouncements on these things, but there's virtually no research done on these.
But that's very interesting. We have a friend of ours, his name is called Mio, and he says, I don't mind paying taxes, but I want to decide where my money goes.
Yes.
So that's.
Well, I
that's
think that this idea of making some of science, the idea of 1% is a very modest proposal. Some would say, why don't you say 10% or 20% or 50% or 100%? I've deliberately proposed 1% because it's so small an amount that it's very hard for the science establishment to object, because if they say, we don't want 99% of your money, we want 100% of your money, it doesn't sound too good. Not a very defensible position. Also, I've found that various people in the political world are quite open to this. I mean, they're not there to represent the science establishment. They would like to represent the public, and if they think they'd get votes through something like this, then they'd do it. And if they thought it could be administered in a reasonably simple way. So I think there's quite a good chance of science reform through science funding. And as soon as there's a source of funding for other things, not just within the narrow limits of the present system, a lot of scientists would find new projects to work on. It would liberate a lot of scientists. After all, most scientists don't like the present system. They find it constrictive. It restricts originality. And 20 years ago, in the NIH in the United States, more than 30% of its grants went to researchers under 35 years old. Today, less than 4% goes to researchers under 35 years old. Science has become more and more concentrated in fewer and fewer labs with more and more powerful lab chiefs, and younger creative researchers
produced what they could produce,
yes,
and who have no new idea, and they're just repeating the whole stuff over and over again.
Yes,
and the young people
and
who have
young
ideas
people are on short-term contracts as postdoctoral fellows, as kind of labour for successful lab chiefs. So the system is not popular even among scientists. So I think the chances of reforming it are quite great, but it's not just a battle of ideas. It requires a reform in the funding structure. I know this from years of experience. I often give talks in scientific institutes. I often find people are open to what I'm saying. Some even say we'd like to do research on that, but of course we can't because we'd never get a grant. And they're right, they wouldn't. I have people write to me at least one a month saying they want to do PhD projects on the kinds of things I'm interested. Can they come and work with me? My answer is no. I have no funding at all. I couldn't possibly help, I'm afraid, and I wish it were otherwise. So the structure of the present system controls what happens through funding largely. you can do what you like if you don't require funding. I mean, no one physically stops me doing my research, although it's unpopular with some members of the science establishment. They can't physically stop me. They can stop me getting money, but if I can get money from elsewhere, or if I can do really cheap research that doesn't need much money, then I can do it. But I'm lucky to get...
You're really great at that, figuring out how to do the research with practically no money, on shoestring.
Well, it's through necessity.
And with the goodwill of some other people who are really enthusiastic about it. I saw the German team there. They were really enthusiastic about that in your presentation yesterday. Yeah, I wanted to ask you another question, which is, I have a lot of problem with that myself, which is measurements. Measurements actually confirm themselves. They don't necessarily measure the phenomena that we try to measure. So, what's your view of that? How do you measure morphic field?
Well, you can only measure morphic fields through their effects.
Except indirectly.
Yes, but actually you can only measure gravitational fields indirectly. You measure them through the swing of a pendulum or through the movement of a spinning a weight as it twists towards another one. And you can measure electrical fields indirectly through electrical instruments, or magnetic fields you measure through magnetic effects. But I mean, I think morphic fields would simply be measured through morphic effects. I mean, that's how you detect any field, through its effects. So if a morphic...
my point is there any other way of approaching it directly rather than indirectly? Indirectly we assume, so if this is not so, then it must be so. Is there any movement to just go into just pure energy measurements? I know that Valerie Hunt, she's tried to measure the field around us by NASA technology, and she's done some work there.
Well, when people talk about measuring things, they nearly always mean measuring with some electrical apparatus. And there's no particular reason to assume that morphic fields are electrical. I mean, you don't measure gravitational fields with electrical apparatus. And you don't measure quantum quantum non-locality. I mean, you don't do that with it. No. So there's no reason why one has to have some electrical apparatus. I mean, of course, the body has electrical fields, and Valerie Hunt and people measure the body's electrical fields. That's fair enough. But we don't have to assume that morphic fields are electrically measurable. They may be. I'm not saying they're not, but I don't. And I'd be quite happy if you could measure them. But everything I've seen where people measure things with electrical apparatus lead to complicated and difficult results to interpret. Because
that's why I'm saying that the measurements determine themselves, not necessarily the phenomena that you're observing.
Yes.
So that to me that represents a problem.
Well, it depends why you want to measure things in the first place. I mean, I'd be interested in looking at how far morphic fields stretch out beyond the surface of bodies and so on. I'm interested in... But you can look indirectly. I mean, if telepathy is a morphic field effect, which I think it is, then you can measure the effects of distance, like I did in my telephone experiments, by doing it over different distances, see if the effect falls off, and it doesn't. So that's a measurement. You've got something you can quantify. You can measure the effect of distance. You can measure whether they work better with familiar or unfamiliar people. They do. So you can actually make measurements using these biological methods. And after all, within psychology, people do, they measure all sorts of things which are to do with our perceptual abilities. They ask people, imagine rotating this particular object and see whether it fits that shape or that shape. And so you look at some puzzling shape, you imagine rotating it, then you answer whether it's this or this one. And they measure how long it takes you to do that. And they find if it only involves a rotation of 30 degrees or something, you do it in half a second. If it involves a more complicated rotation, it takes 1.5, 10 seconds or something. So they can actually measure how long your mental process of rotating something in your mind takes. So psychologists have already got all sorts of quantitative ways of getting at measuring mental processes. They're quite skillful in doing that.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you is when you were mentioning how there is no effective distance in relation to things like telepathy with morphic resonance fields, what occurs to me is you looked at the variable of emotional connectivity, if we could use that word, and as being certainly a significant factor in the performance or the facilitation of those kinds of communication. Now, from a brain physiology point of view, which is obviously a structure and not so much just a field, we know that the right brain, to generalize, the right brain tends to be intuitive in its orientation, or we just can say that those aspects or structures within the brain which are intuitive in their nature lend themselves to telepathy capability. That implies, to me, this notion that the human brain, the human mind as well, is the emotional system is essentially a field-based system of detection as opposed to the left brain system, which tends to be very specific in its organization of information, linear, logical, arithmetic, so forth. So I'm wondering, you must have looked at that. Obviously, you've had that finding, so you might have some thoughts about what you think is going on.
Well, I think the way the brain works is in terms of field. I mean, after all, what we know about brain physiology is based on electroencephalograph measurements, which are measurements of changing fields in the brain. So the brain certainly has electrical fields that are changing all the time, and my view is that morphic fields would influence patterns of activity in the brain, in the left brain and in the right brain. I don't think the right brain works like a digital computer. I don't think any part of the brain works that way. I think the brain is a system of indeterminate, sort of semi-chaotic, dynamic possibilities, and changes are going on. It's highly unstable, and morphic fields come in and impose patterns on what would otherwise be indeterminate, random, or chaotic. And so there's a constant interaction of the brain which is highly sensitive to the influence of these fields, and these fields pattern the activity of the brain. And I think that's how the whole brain works. I don't think that the left brain works in a digital computing. They're all field effects. It may be the right brain is to do with larger scale fields, but actually what we know about the way the brain, different parts of the brain are involved in visual attention and so on. There are various areas of the brain light up in these brain scans that all seem to be working together, even involving words and language, left brain activities. They're all field effects. It may be the right brain is to do with larger scale fields, but actually what we know about the way the brain, different parts of the brain are involved in visual attention and so on. There are various areas of the brain light up in these brain scans that all seem to be working together, even involving words and language, left brain activities. And among people in consciousness studies, what they call this is the binding problem. If you've got different bits of the brain involved in different things, you don't experience little fragments of activity. You experience a unified thing, like when I see you talking. I see you, I hear you talking, I understand your words. That's left brain, but the visual thing is right brain. The general feeling is probably right brain. But it's integrated into a single experience. That's the binding problem, and I think that this integration, which occurs all the time, must be a field phenomenon. I don't see any other way it could work.
There is something in epilepsy that may confirm this. When we have focus in one side of the brain, after enough time, the other part of the brain corresponding to that one develops the same focus, and so we have two now epileptic focuses. That's been described in literature. So it can only happen if it's a field in which the other part, which has capacity to resonate, the part on the affected side, develops the same function and therefore creates its own structure to fit with the other one.
I didn't know that. You mean that if the focus starts on one side and then there's a symmetrical activation?
Symmetrical activation and focus develops on the other side as well. That's been described in literature. So that would fit that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and also in rheumatoid arthritis, there is usually the same joints get affected on the opposite sides. So again, must be something, because similar structures in the same field, they can resonate the field and they can develop the corresponding changes.
Yes. Well, that's interesting. I mean, I suppose the conventional view would be that they're both equally susceptible to chemicals in the blood or something, and they both suffer similarly. But I think myself, I believe that there's a resonance between symmetrical structures, and I think it's true in the inorganic world too. Like in snowflakes, where you get each snowflake has 6 arms that are the same as each other, but every snowflake is different from every other one. So how is the growth of those arms coordinated? There must be a kind of resonance within the snowflake.
There is a question that a friend of mine was hoping that I would ask, and she was at your talk last night, and saw the parrot experiment, and was wondering if the effect being noted in the parrot, we were giving too much credit to the parrot, when in fact the owner of the parrot, being the transmitter, so to speak, shouldn't be looked at to the same degree as the parrot. No doubt the parrot is echoing something, but have you done any research any component of research to look at what effect the transmitter might be having in this process of transmission of information?
Well, obviously telepathy is a relation between the two, so it involves both the transmitter and the receiver, and if they have an emotional bond, then it works a lot much better than if they don't. And LeMay is particularly psychic herself, so I mean she's probably particularly good as a transmitter. But Hannah, who was here, the drummer, I mean he lived with this parrot for years, and it responded to him, and it even responds to me telepathically when I visit. Sometimes it seems to pick up what I'm not as well as with LeMay or with Hannah, but I think it's a relationship. I don't think it's just that the parrot's a kind of passive receiver that's sort of just picking up stuff beamed by LeMay. It seems to be attuned to what she's doing, and telepathy is this. You do have both sides involved because it's a relational process.
Right. And her concern was that it was, the parrot was basically, as we say in the idiom, parroting, and it was like the Charlie's ventriloquist dummy just echoing
Oh no, I don't think it's like that. When you actually see the way the parrot talks, it has its own personality. It says its own things, and it makes its own points, and sometimes when she was taking the camera, it would say, "Why are you going away? Come back. Why are you growly with me?" The parrot would say, because it doesn't like being left alone, you see. And in these experiments, when she went to another room, the parrot was sometimes, as she was going downstairs, was protesting about this. And so it's definitely got its own point of view, and it's not simply all the time parroting what she thinks.
This brings me to a question about yoga. Now, I know you spent considerable time in southern India and probably studied both yoga and practiced. And some of your comments last night, and this sort of builds on what you were just saying about the relationship, in the principle, and certainly Patanjali was talking about when a being gives focus to a specific item, he goes into what we might call a yoga union and comes to a knowledge. There's a practice called sanyam, you may know of or heard of, where if an individual gives great focus to a particular object, he can actually come to know its essence. And of course these things were handed down through both oral tradition and written tradition ultimately in India, and so in a sense this sort of represents some of the first evidence of maybe a morphic resonance principle. Of course those were not the terminologies that they were using, but given the fact that you've lived in India and have probably been exposed to yoga, do you see a parallel between those two philosophies, or your particular view and this philosophy?
Well, I mean, yoga is quite a complicated system, and I on the whole, I see quite a lot of parallels. I did study yoga to some extent in India, and I practice. I mean, I always do the Surya Namaskar every morning. It's a greeting of the sun exercise. I've done that every day for 25 years, including today. So part of my interest in yoga is purely practical, but it is relational. Even the Surya Namaskar, of course, is relating one to the sun and to the cycles of the day. Yes, I don't know, when they talk about the siddhis, and some of them are sort of telepathic, like understanding the cries of all creatures, they obviously depend on forming a close link with other things and having a kind of telepathic knowledge. Yes, I mean, I think Indians understood this and formulated it, but I think practically all traditional people do as well. You know, if you look at shamanic cultures where the shaman, one of the roles of the shaman is relating to animals, knowing where animals are. They relate to animal spirits, finding game animals, you know, flying like a bird, and so on. A lot of it is to do with relating to other species by somehow connecting with their fields or their spirits. So I think that yoga grows out of that kind of thing, and it's just more systematic than most shamanic traditions, and it's sort of got elaborated much more.
Based on what you said, and you've talked about extended mind, the impression I have is that mind has, or the consciousness has this plasticity about it, that it could literally focus on almost anything and develop a resonance with it, create a kind of field, because emotional interactions of any sort where an emotional link is created is creating effectively that field. The field comes into existence. So that the mind, we come to assume, certainly from the Western perspective, we've come to assume that the brain and the mind are co-located. And it seems to be that perhaps the brain has evolved largely as a default locating area where the mind, because this is seen as a vehicle of emanation of, that we tend to associate the mind limited to the brain and the corporeal structure, whereas really what we seem to be moving beyond is a boundary where it says, no, the mind is actually resident and resonant with the potential for resonance with anything, anywhere.
Well, usually the relationship is between ourselves embodied here in the particular place where we are, and whatever we're relating to there in its place. And so normally it's located, and the only places where it's not strictly located is in our dreams. But even in the dreams there's a kind of location, because I have a dream body in my dreams which is in a particular place, even if it's an imaginary space. It's not everywhere, it's somewhere, and it's got a particular environment around it. So this is our normal condition, even when we're out of our bodies, as it were. Even out of body experiences, people are still located somewhere on the ceiling of the room or something, looking down at their body, and they can then go at will somewhere else, but they're not nowhere. They're not spread out uniformly everywhere. So I think there's always a locational sense to our center of consciousness. It has a kind of center in some sort of space.
Well, I was just meditating this morning before I was going to interview you, and I was recalling the dialogue that you had with Matthew Fox about attending to and intending. And what occurred to me is that a lot of times when we say love, we think of a love in relation to an object as opposed to just pure love. And I note that in Eastern philosophy, of course, certainly within Hinduism, the notion of merging with God, one literally becomes indistinguishable from God, and that it is emergence into the totality of whatever qualities or pre-qualities that God is, so that you have a love state that is not object-related either in time or space, but it's just the pure field of love, and you're just love, period. You're not attending to an object anymore. We think of object because perhaps we're built with a sensory system, and we tend to gravitate to that bias, and we just say, oh, well, that must be the case. But it need not be only so. It may be that we have a broader capability which is beyond object in space and time.
Well, possibly. I mean, I see love as something to do with the relationship of parts of a whole. So there's a field around any social group, and say a couple, a family, then they're all part of a field, and the interaction between them is something we can often experience as love of parents for children, or love of lovers for each other, and so on. So I'd see it as within a field. Now, if we take the field of God includes the entire universe, then we're part of a whole, which is the whole of all things. So I think that love is still bounded in the sense that it's within a larger system. It's a relationship within a larger system. And in the Christian model of God, which is a relational model of God, the Holy Trinity, then you have a kind of organic model of God. God's an organism with different parts in relation to each other, and the relation between those is a relationship of love. But in no part of this system do we have pure love, totally undirected to any object and sort of detached from all other relations. So that's the way I'd see it.
Seems like you have more tendency to stay with the form than the formless.
I think the two are involved with each other. I see energy as a formless principle of change or activity, and the field principle is that which gives it form, shape, structure, and limitation.
Of it, yeah.
And I think that's intrinsic in most fundamental models of reality. You know, if you take the model of the Holy Trinity, which is the one I work with most since I'm a Christian, you have the idea of the source of all things, which is God the Father, and then you have the formless principle, the Holy Spirit, which is the breath or the wind, is the moving principle, the principle of change. And in Indian religions, it's when they translate Christianity into Indian languages, even Baptist missionaries, the only word they can use for the Holy Spirit is Shakti.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so you've got the Shakti principle, the Spirit principle, and you've got the form principle, the Logos. The second person of the Trinity is the principle of form, limitation, order, and structure, which in nature is reflected in fields. So you've got energy in fields, and the modern view of science is that everything's made of energy in fields, that no energy is without some form or structure. Even radiant light energy has particular wavelengths and photons, it's quantized, etc. It can take on many different forms, any kind of energy can take, but there's always this interplay of energy and fields. And what makes things different from each other, each species of plant, each species of animal, each place, the quality of everything depends on the fields, not on the energy. But of course, without energy, nothing would exist. And the other, I find helpful the Christian metaphor of spirit and word, which is the traditional, the word of God and the spirit of God as the two persons of the Trinity, with God as the source of both. The principal metaphor there is simply speaking, that without the flow of breath, no words come out. You can have silent words in your mind, but unless they're born on the flow of the breath, nothing can come out into the world. And if you don't have the words, you just have the flow of the breath, then there's no word, no meaning. But as I'm speaking now, it's a combination of form, structure, limitation, pattern, and flow. And that, I think, is a model of the way reality is, and the Hindu model of Shiva and Shakti, where in the Tantric model, Shakti is this formless principle of energy, change, undirected change, whereas Shiva is the principle in that model of limitation, form, structure. It's another way of expressing it.
We can use reductionary understanding of what you're saying. You're saying a lot, so we can talk about all kinds of things. What I hear you say is that the field is really translator or gateway from energy to matter and the other way around.
Yes, that matter is, according to modern physics, energy bound within fields.
Right.
That's what it is. And if it's not bound, it's always within fields. And light energy is within fields too. And the atom, the electron, the proton and stuff, all of these, according to quantum field theory, are quantized energy within fields. So all matter is energy in fields. And Sir Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, I like quoting him because, when he says through modern physics, materialism has transcended itself because matter is no longer the fundamental reality. It emerges from fields and energy.
At this point in the interview, it appeared as though it was concluding, since we were originally only supposed to have 30 minutes. To our surprise, it continued for another 10 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, I do. Where you're based? Oh, Ottawa, yes.
I'm in Ottawa. I'm teaching at the University of Ottawa in psychiatry.
Yes.
So
I see. Well, you must find, talking about things with colleagues, you must find yourself
alone.
Slightly out of tune with many.
That's why I asked you the question.
Yes.
You got it.
Yes. But actually,
because they're not there. Most of them are not there, or they don't dare to be there.
I find more people are open than one initially imagines. And a very revealing thing happened. I was asked to speak in Cambridge at the Department of Animal Behaviour, where they were in the veterinary school, talking about my work with psychic pets. And this is a group of people who work on companion animals. They work on pets. That's their subject. And so I just talked about what I do. I mean, I just told them the experiments, the results. And the guy who'd invited me was very interested. That's why he'd invited me. And afterwards he said, I'm so glad you did this because I'm really interested in it. I think what you're doing is really important and stuff. And but the others are really straight. And one by one, these people took me aside and they all told me, that's why I went into this, because I've always thought pets could do this. I said, but I can't talk about it to my colleagues because they're all so straight. So, I mean, after all 6 members of the department said this to me, one after another, including the professor. So when I had them all together a bit later, I said, why don't you guys come out? Because you'd have so much more fun. Because they're all pretending they've known each other for years. Mm-hmm. And I think within science, in my experience, there are plenty of people actually who are open-minded, but they keep it very, very quiet. And I think the model we need in science is the gay liberation movement, because there's plenty of people there, closet holists and so on. Yes. And if they all came out, science would look completely different. Conversations would be going on in science departments and universities, completely different from what they are now.
Yeah, I gave a talk on body, mind, spirit, and soul. And to psychiatrists and the department of psychiatry, and I had some strange comments when I mentioned your work and the work of Valerie Hunt, and I had someone who is doing healing using the energy. So I had some strange looks from some people, and it's very interesting that nurses who were there, few of them, they responded beautifully to that. They have open mind for some reason. Medical students too. Yeah.
Well, maybe even the psychiatrists with strange looks, you see, they may have felt they ought to give you strange looks, that was sort of required. You were speaking heresy, and therefore they should show that they recognized it was heresy. But that may be independent of what they actually believe. And so my own view is that I'd make no secret. I've nothing to lose, you see, because I've lost everything in terms of official funding, etc. So I'm free. So I speak quite freely wherever I go, and I find that a lot of people are actually much more open than you'd think. And the most surprising invitation of all in the last year was when I was asked to speak to the European Molecular Biology Laboratory in Heidelberg, which is the absolute hardcore reductionist center of science. Yeah. And I was very surprised they invited me. I went there. And I gave the seminar. The main seminar room was completely packed, standing room only. And I talked about the kinds of things that I was talking about last night. I thought there's no point pretending to be doing something else. I would just say what I'm really doing. And they were extraordinarily open. And, the leading guy there was a silence. They waited at the end to see which way he went. Because, he said, when I came into this room, I was a skeptic. A standard skeptic. He said, I hadn't thought about it. I just got the standard views that everyone's brought up with in science. He said, but after what you've said, this sounds like science. You're doing real experiments. That, and after all, if in quantum theory you can have electrons influencing each other at a distance, he said, what's the big deal with telepathy? He said, and then he got into the details. He asked me about some of the experiments. Did you try this? Did you do that control? What happens if... And some of them I'd done, some I hadn't. So some of them he said, did you do this control? I said, yes, here are the data. Then he said, what happens if you analysed it this way? I said, okay, here it is. Then he said, what if you do it that way? I said, hadn't thought of that, good idea, I'll try it. And so we were talking science, you see.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And the general attitude there was one of science. And as a result of it, 2 weeks ago, I received as a result of that, I got a request from the editor of a special edition of the Journal of Molecular Biology asking me to write a paper for the Journal of Molecular Biology based on what I talked about in Heidelberg, a field approach to the mind, and then how this might be relevant to developmental biology. So there are people who are open, and much more than one might think. I would never have guessed that would be a place where there'd be openness to this on any level, let alone virtually the entire institute being open.
Yes. Hopefully it foreshadows something good for the future.